Good morning, everyone. It's indeed an honor to be delivering this keynote address at the 19th Quadrennial Congress of the International Council on Archives here in Abu Dhabi. As a lifelong student of history myself, I'm deeply privileged to have this opportunity to address members and delegates of the world's foremost international body for the cooperation and preservation of our archives. You are, in many ways, the gatekeepers of our collective heritage, and I'm truly delighted to join you this morning. I've been asked to speak on preserving memories and their importance in building modern nations. And that's a fascinating theme. Since the end of the Second World War, and certainly owing to the cataclysms of the Cold War era, we all have a fair idea as to what constitutes a modern nation. Most of us feel it has a lot to do with a sort of constitutional nationalism, where the focus is supposed to be on individual liberty and dignity, alongside such things as protecting pluralism and promoting a liberal market, though, of course, in some countries it may be tempered with state control. Now, creating such a nation is far from easy, for many of the concepts that underpin constitutionalism are Western in origin, and as such cannot easily be foisted upon societies with a different constitutional ethos. So an effort is required to wed them to that nation's indigenous values and precepts, practices, and customs. These, in turn, are firmly rooted in the nation's history. How a nascent nation interprets or reinterprets its history and historical traditions in order to create space for constitutional models is what determines its fate as a modern nation. Against this backdrop, we must examine the role history and historical memory and its preservation play in nurturing modern nations. That leads to the question, what exactly is the role of history? At any given point, and certainly in nations as steeped in antiquity as my own, India, the bone of contention is not so much history, so much as how that history is being remembered. After all, there can be such a thing as my history and your history. The way we remember different facts can become bones of contention. What and how modern nations choose to remember is what defines them. Some of you are familiar with the famous concept of Ernest Renan in France, who argued that forgetting was as important as memory in building a modern nation, that one had to forget some of the painful aspects of the past in order to forge a nation together. Now, there is an interesting discussion, a distinction drawn between history and historical collective memory by the French philosopher and sociologist Maurice Halbwachs. He took the view that how we choose to remember our history is a collective social phenomenon. In other words, it's an evocation of the past that is constructed and shared by the members of a social group or the citizens of a nation. Collective memory, argues Halbwachs, is vital for the life and survival of a society. Indeed, it's what constitutes a society, and its cornerstone is the cornerstone of its identity. The historian Eric Hobsbawm from Britain argued that the past is the essential element in nationalistic ideologies. If there is no suitable past, he writes, it can always be invented. The past legitimizes. The past gives a more glorious background to a present that does not have much to show for itself. Hobsbawm compares the role of history in nationalism with that of the poppy to the heroin addict. It is the source of the drug that both poisons and empowers the nationalist. For nations like mine that arose from the ashes of colonialism or imperialism, it became necessary to decide how they must remember their past. The path to the future, paved with ideals having a Western hue, had nevertheless to resemble a familiar and oft-traveled road. After the Russian Revolution, for instance, the Bolsheviks went about annihilating all traces of Tsarist Russia and knitting together a patchwork of sundry disparate nations anchored in a fierce loathing of imperialism and a suffocating, though increasingly involuntary, commitment to Soviet communism, the diktats of the Bolsheviks. And so it was in China after Mao's revolution, which, upon bringing the communists to power, triggered a whole array of other revolutions that sought to demonize the former power elite and usher in a new and supposedly egalitarian culture. But the appeal to a positive historical memory as opposed to this negative can play a significant role in constructing the nationalism of the present. So India, for example, after being torn under by grotesque internecine violence at the time of freedom, what we called our partition, decided to purvey a syncretic and integrative notion of nationhood, grounded in the evocation of a past that portrayed India as a bedazzling mosaic of people, cultures, languages, stories, and faiths. Perhaps the best articulation of this pluralist vision of India comes from our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who famously refers to his nation in his book, The Discovery of India, as an ancient palimpsest. You know what a palimpsest is, as he explains it himself, on which layer upon layer of thought and reverie has been inscribed, and yet no succeeding layer had completely hidden or erased what had been written previously. So he was saying all aspects of our history had to be preserved. Now, how we in India chose to remember our history mirrored our pursuit of nation building. What sort of society India was to become flowed directly from our founding fathers' outlook on the past, on history and memory. There's a book by an LSE academic that argues that rather than giving up religion altogether, Indian secularism was conceived as a mechanism for including members of all religions in the national project. So, for example, we had a situation in 1956 where India's most prominent public figures, the President, the Prime Minister, senior members of the Cabinet, all got together amongst great pomp and circumstance to commemorate the 2500th birth anniversary of Buddha, Prince Siddhartha in India, Buddha Jayanti. Now, that the leading Indian politicians of the time should have participated in such an endeavor is emblematic of how India chose to remember its past. Because today, Buddhism is a tiny minority faith. Not even 1% of the population follows it. Yet, the Buddha Jayanti was exultantly celebrated because the India that we sought to build post-partition was predicated on the remembrance of a composite history, a history in which every Indian, regardless of differences and bygones, had an equal place. But as Halbwachs also concedes, historical collective memory is far from being immutable. It's dynamic, and as such contingent on multiple factors. Citizens conform to the collective memory of their nation or group, especially if they're part of a majority. And they adjust their individual memories to align with narratives prevailing across the nation. In some cases, a nation's collective history might evolve. That is to say, it might become more capacious to give greater space and liberties to communities formerly suppressed on grounds of race, sex, color, religion, language, faith, and all of that. Or it might just devolve. Leaders with autocratic tendencies are usually responsible for a regression of their nation's collective memory. By appealing to negative historical memory, they saddle their collective history with jingoism, xenophobia, resentments about the past, and this vitiates the social fabric of society, enabling modern autocrats to demonize certain sections of their own population and blame them for all that is wrong with their nation on the basis of what their ancestors might have done 300, 400 years ago. The result is a majoritarian tendency to control the discourse around history, so that the nation's heritage becomes the monopoly of one group, following which every other piece of history that the autocrats consider inconvenient is discarded. This evokes both a sense of belonging to a common endeavor for the majority and a sense of exclusion and alienation for the disfavored minority. How can we preclude this bleak prospect from besetting a modern nation? How can we advance from a narrow collective history to a more commodious one that will galvanize nation building and national integration? Well, it's precisely here that disputes arise. The more sprawling a nation, the more varied its history, the more rancorous these debates become. After all, no country can be looked upon as a nation unless its citizens feel they belong together, owing to some common element. This has been noted by scholars like Benedict Anderson, who've told us that a nation is an imagined political community that reflects a single national identity built upon shared social characteristics such as culture, language, religion, ethnicity, and a common history. Whenever new nations come into being or new regimes emerge in a nation, there's an attempt to redefine the nation, the notion of nationhood, by tailoring it to the new regime's or the incumbent regime's version of history. This creates a new collective conscience. The new conscience might be at odds with the foundational idea of the nation. So again, it's not history, but the ways in which you choose to use history, the way in which historical memories are used by nationalist ideologues that lead to atrocities. In countries that are enormous and diversely chaotic, there can never be a single national memory that has primacy over all other memories. At any given point, there are always countless memories clamoring to be hailed as the predominant one. Now that, of course, is impossible. And so it is that these countries' renditions of the past, especially in places like mine, infuse the present with an acrimony which at times becomes intractable and deeply polarizes the people. This is something that all modern nations must try to prevent. For nation building and national integration, what's important is affording the nation's different communities, many if not all of which have their own contending versions of history, a berth wide enough to accommodate those differing historical memories. And all can be subsumed in a project of democratic myth-making. You can call it memory-making if you like. The saga of how a nation comes to be, how it fought its colonists, threw them out, established a democratic republic guaranteeing liberty, equality, and fraternity to all, tends to be harped on ceaselessly by the government and even by civil society. This would allow different communities to take pride in their own histories and at the same time feel they belong to the nation whose birth was a moment of great deliverance for them and as such must be cherished. Of course, some countries have done this with great success, some with less success. As a writer myself, I would argue that art and literature play a critical role in this project of democratic myth-making. Artists and creative writers seek to make sense of the vicissitudes in their nation's fortunes and to reclaim the cultural identity that centuries' worth of cultural or imperial rule robbed or deprived them of. Post-colonial literature, for instance, has sought to achieve precisely this goal. Such writers may immerse dry and dreary history into the vibrance and glory of mythical epics and folklore, which inform and feed the nation's collective conscience. And of course, these are tales whose characters and scenarios already stalk the imaginations of the nation's citizens, becoming over the course of time nationally understood metaphors that speak to the present, to what's happening in the nation at any time. Every modern nation needs to weld together these sort of Western concepts, if you like, of constitutionalism and the nation's own historical traditions and customs. So in my first novel, for example, now over 30 years ago, the great Indian novel, I used our ancient epic, the Mahabharata, which every Indian is familiar with, as well as the story of our 20th century struggle for freedom from British rule, and I merged them together to tell and to retell the political history of 20th century India through a reimagining of the great epic, fictionally recasting its episodes, events, and characters.